Thank you. So welcome everybody. I'm super excited to have you here today and to work with you through the expert talk on what's new in ASP.NET Core 3.1 by Skill Me Up. So my name is Brian and I'll be your trainer today. And I've been in .NET development for basically since it came out early 2000s, about 2001 in the pre-release version. So I've been around for a while, so I have a little bit of experience with it. But I'd love to connect with you. If you have Twitter or LinkedIn, if you want to reach out to me, those are my credentials there on the left. And I also just wanted to highlight that I do have the MCSD certification. So yeah. All right, so today what I'd like to do is just walk through with you some new changes and some new things that I hope you'll find exciting. I have found them extremely exciting going through, learning a few things in the last couple of years as .NET Core has matured. And I'm really excited to share some of this with you because I think there are some things in here that if you haven't seen, you'll be really excited about, and maybe some things that might be a little confusing. So it's always good to have those things on your radar. So what I'd like to do is start out by talking about Blazor. I don't know how many of you are here today because of Blazor or just hoping to hear about Blazor, but Blazor will be the first thing we talk about. So we'll spend a little time there, and then we're going to talk about the new communication protocols for gRPC, which is similar to what you may have done in the past with WCF. So there may be some questions and confusion around what the heck is gRPC and what's it for. And then we'll talk about just some overarching changes that are happening within the .NET Core ecosystem. One of them, a big one, is going to be a change in JSON, and not in how JSON works, but how which libraries you use to interact with it. We'll look at a little bit about SignalR, just a couple of changes there, some hosting and startup configuration changes that we want to be aware of. We'll talk about some new EventCounters that are coming or that have already been released and that you could use. And then we'll take a look at the other new type of project that you may have heard about or maybe interested in, Razor Pages. And we'll close up today just looking at a few of the breaking changes and kind of an overview or a look into the future. So yeah, so I'm excited to present this stuff to you. So if you just bear with me for 1 second, I'm not sure how I can't see the chat right now. And that really bothers me a lot. So let me hold on a second. Yeah, okay. So just be aware that I am unable to see, when I'm doing this presentation, I'm unable to see your chat. So ordinarily I'd say just shoot your questions throughout the session and I'll answer them as we go. Unfortunately, what I'm gonna have to do is go ahead and do the presentation, do some of the demos here with you. And then if you have questions, we'll take them at the end. And you can put them in the chat along the way, but just know that I can't monitor that while I'm doing this demo. So I apologize in advance if that breaks our flow a little bit more than it would have liked. So, all right. So obviously the big change, the new thing, the new hotness is Blazor. And so actually Blazor comes in two flavors. And so we're going to take a look at both of those a little bit today, because I think what you'll see is Blazor has a lot to offer you along the way. So the biggest question I've seen through the last year and a half or so is, does this mean JavaScript is dead? And the answer to that question is absolutely not. Now, there's some caveats to that. First of all, Blazor is going to use WebAssembly or going to be using the WebAssembly compiled version. And what that will do is give you a chance to not have to do any client-side JavaScript, but you may still need it. And so what happens is you can actually still leverage JavaScript calls from Blazor. Now, the other thing I'll say is JavaScript is not going away. JavaScript is an ecosystem that obviously has plenty of space that it's occupying and will occupy into the future, even with Blazor out there or other WebAssembly flavors out there. JavaScript is going to be around. So you'll want to make sure you keep your JavaScript skills up, not only for your current work, probably the work that you're doing on current projects, but legacy projects, as well as maybe even new projects, because Blazor may not be adopted in the industry as much as one would hope. But we'll see as the years go on. So just don't start saying, well, I don't need JavaScript anymore because of Blazor, because that's not going to be true, at least not for the next few years. So one cool thing about Blazor is This does allow you to focus in. It allows you to write .NET in C# or whatever .NET flavor you'd like, but primarily C# is what we're looking at here to compile down to Blazor. And what happens is it basically can write then your code and run everywhere. So now you can use .NET to do whatever you need to do. So you can run it on your server, you can run it on the web, you can write your code, compile it down to WebAssembly via Blazor, and voila, you have a fully functional client application with website. It's a single page architecture, which means, of course, that it's just like any other JavaScript framework where there's basically one page that's loaded, and the architecture then works together to load components and interacting components instead of actually reloading full pages, which you may be used to if you're working with something like a web forms or even an MVC that you're jumping between different controllers and pages. So it might be a little bit of a difference there if you've not worked with something like an Angular or React. It's also capable of doing progressive web applications. So what does that mean? I think the easiest thing to keep in mind for a progressive web app is just to remember that that's primarily going to be things like gestures. So not only are you doing your web application, but you're able to respond to people being able to zoom in with their fingers or slide things around with their fingers. Now, the caveat to that is that I do not think that it works very well on iPhones at this point because of the fact that iPhones and Apple have a very tight ecosystem that they don't really let you interact with. Whereas in Android and in the .NET world, of course, we can get into that framework and we can get into the underlying stuff, the libraries underneath that allow gesturing and things to happen much easier. So that being said, if you're going to try to write a progressive web app with Blazor, be aware that it may have a few problems for your iPhone clients. So just be prepared for that. So the nice thing, again, about Blazor being all in on .NET is that you can write standard .NET libraries and you can share your code then between your Blazor apps and your web services and whatever else you want to write, and your server apps, whatever, that run and use that same standard library, and you don't have to write the code multiple times to use in multiple places. The final thing to note is that with Blazor, with the adoption of Blazor as it continues to pick up, we've seen your favorite people that have developed your components libraries for the last 20 years. You've got your Telerix, your Infragistics, Dev, I can't remember their name, Dev somebody another, Dev Express or something like that. I can't remember if they've changed their name now. Anyway, all of those major players that you're used to using, whichever flavor you're used to, whether it's Telerik or Infragistics or Dev Express or whatever it is, those are all already available. People from their companies have already released component libraries to integrate with Blazor. So you will be able to use the familiar tools that you're used to, maybe even keep your apps looking the same as they did, even if you're using Blazor. Obviously, maybe a little different experience, but hopefully familiar for your users. All right, so the nice thing is if you've been working with MVC at all, then you're going to be very familiar with how some of the server-side Blazor stuff works, and even some of the client side. So it's pretty cool because you're just basically having your shared layouts just like you had in an MVC project. And again, you have this @body attribute down there, kind of towards the bottom, you see that, and that's where the injection of your core components are being handled. And so you have it's basically just like your views in MVC, or you have your shared layout view, and then you have your injected views inside of them. So it's very similar to that. Now there's going to be a few differences, of course, but it's very similar to that feel. So also along with Blazor, this is a server demo app. You can see here that you have CSS and Bootstrap, just like you would be used to if you're writing MVC or any other web app at this point, probably. So it's not going to be as unfamiliar as maybe you might think it would be. So there are a couple things with how Blazor works, maybe a little different than what you're used to. So what you see here is, again, that injected body down there on the bottom right for the inherits component base. The inherits is going to be how they're going to inject different classes into the actual code, which is really cool. You also have on the top left up there, you have the inject attribute, or Razor directive for the forecast service. So you can see you can actually inject a service into your page here. And then of course you write your code just like you would with any other Razor syntax, @ sign, if, do this, whatever you need to do. So again, it's fairly familiar code layout and use. It's just a few slight tweaks that are going to be a little bit different. So when you're creating a server app, you'll just go in, you'll say, I want to create a new Blazor application, and you'll get a choice between a Blazor server app or Blazor WebAssembly app. And that's where the difference is. One of them is going to run on the server side more than the other one. The WebAssembly is going to run on the client. And so that's how you can think of that. But basically, it's almost going to be exactly the same, just one or two projects and where things are going to, and how things are going to compile and actually run. So if you want to keep your thing server side, you'd do a Blazor server app, and that would give you the chance to do your identity just like you would with an MVC. And then you can see you can configure it for HTTPS just like any other Blazor app would, or just an MVC app would do. And you can also put it in Docker if you want. So the options there are basically, do you want identity or not? And do you want to host it in a container? And do you want to make it HTTPS? When you do the WebAssembly app, you get a couple other choices added in. One of them is going to be whether or not you want to host it with ASP.NET Core, and also if you want to have a progressive web application. So generally, you probably just check both of those unless you don't want progressive web app, or if you're going to host your Blazor somewhere other than an ASP.NET Core project. And so what I thought we could do is take some time now and actually just work through a couple of demos here on building Blazor apps so that you could see this in action, see how quick you can get up and running, and see what that might look like for you. So what I'd like to do is bring up Visual Studio. Well, let's start actually with the command line, because you can actually, of course, now do most of your stuff that you want to do with command lines. So let me go ahead and just bring up the .NET developer command prompt here. Just bear with me a second. You can't see what I'm doing on the other screen. I'm going to run that as administrator just to be safe, and then I'll bring it over here. All right, so I'm just going to change directory down to the C drive. I'm just going to make a quick directory here for live demos. And then I'm going to CD into live demos. So I'm living on my demonstration here. Let me just zoom in this text a little bit so it's a little easier to see. All right, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say .NET new Blazor server. So this is going to build a server application. Now, if you wanted to, you could say no HTTPS. I think here for attributes like that, you can also name it or put it in a different folder. And so I'm just going to put this in the root for now, and we can move it later if we need to. Basically just going to call this .NET new Blazor server. It's going to go ahead and create it. And then you should be able to do a .NET run. But when I did that a couple times, it seems to take a long time to load. And so I don't really want to wait for that too much. So maybe it'll load faster today, but it didn't. The last couple times I've done that hasn't run very quickly. So let me just pull up the application correctly. Okay. So we're under live demos. You can see it's actually just kind of sitting there. It seems to have hung. I'm not sure why this part takes so long, other than it's probably got to bring down all the NuGet packages and all the stuff that it does when it builds, right? So you're probably used to that. Let's just go ahead and open this with Visual Studio. So I'm on Visual Studio 2019. There is one update version that came out yesterday that I haven't downloaded, but other than that, I would say I'm on the latest version of 2019. So I don't have like a special preview edition installed. I haven't enabled any preview flags on this. This is actually the current 2019 instance. While this is loading, let's just let that see if it ever loads up. But in the meantime, let's just take a quick look here. So you see the startup project here on the Blazor is going to be very similar in a server application to what you're used to with an MVC. It's got your configure section where you're going to do your routing. It's got your endpoints. These are a little different maybe than what you've seen in the past, but pretty much the same. And so you see there's actually an environment variable now that you can toggle whether or not you're in development or not, which allows you to do some specific things on error handling or whatever else you want to do for your environment. You also see the directive here to add the Razor pages, add the server-side Blazor, and it's doing this singleton for a weather forecast service, which is this is part of the demo app. So I didn't write any of this code. I just said .NET new Blazor, and it gave me the weather forecast service as its kind of demo project that comes along with it. So maybe it's a little cluttered if you're trying to start your new project and you didn't want the weather forecast service. You might need to clean that up. But you can see here that the weather forecast service is just a weather forecast which has a few properties, and then the service itself is just going to return some different forecast data so that it could be displayed on the web. So nothing fancy, nothing spectacular going on here, just a simple deal. So you have some pages here. This is where your Razor pages live. So you have your counter page, which we'll see in a second. And you can see here, all this is a page that has a variable for current count that is displaying. And then it has a button that it clicks called increment count. You see that's calling a local function and just doing a current count. So you see you're going to get some client side interaction here on the current count on this server application. And then you have your error page, but your fetch data, this is the weather forecast. And again, this is where it's injected into the page. And then the data here is actually just loaded from that forecast data. And so you see that's just going to call to the forecast service, get forecast async. So we'll just put a little breakpoint on that so we can see that. And you can see what's going on there. So this is still not loaded. So this is what I was saying. I'm not sure what happens here with this, that it just kind of bogs down on me. That may not be your experience, but here I'm just going to go ahead and run it just like I would any other application. The other thing is it may bog down in that runner because I did not disable HTTPS, and that might be the problem. It might be stuck in the command line because I didn't disable the HTTPS stuff. So this is running again on a secure connection. But it's a very simple web app. It's spun up already. You see here, click me, click me, click me, click me, click me, working just like you would expect it would. You have your fetch data, which calls back to the server, gets that forecast async, and runs it just like you would expect. There's the data. Of course, there's components to do better grids with sorting that you could easily drop in here, and you'd be up and running with a really nice Blazor application very quickly. So just to compare and contrast a little bit, I wanted to take you through what it looks like to build a client-side version of that. So let's go ahead and create a new project, and we'll create a Blazor app. And I gotta change this, sorry. This needs to be a web. Okay, and so there's my Blazor app. I guess I could have just clicked that one, but I wanted you to see this side. So there's my Blazor app, and then let's go ahead and just drop this into a different location. It doesn't matter. We'll do live demos and then client side. Sorry, live coding, can't type. Okay, and then we're just gonna call this a weather service or something, weather app. All right, and then I'm gonna go ahead and create that. And so hopefully it won't bog down. What you see here is now I'm gonna choose the WebAssembly version this time instead of the server app. When we did the .NET New Blazor server, of course it spun up the server. We're doing the WebAssembly this time. Configured for HTTPS. I'm gonna go ahead and check both these boxes because why not? I'm gonna go ahead and build this out. And so it'll bring up another version of the project, of course, because this is a different layout. And so here what we see, the main difference between the two, let me slide this over just a little, and then hopefully you can see my whole screen. This is on a 1080p connection. So if you don't have 1080p resolution, the stuff on the right may not be as visible as I would hope. For that reason, actually, let me just slide this over. I apologize for the moving around here, but I want to make sure that if you don't have a 1080p that this isn't hard to see. So you can compare and contrast here. The two differences are going to be that this one was one project. The server-side project was one project. It does have the www root just like you would expect to see in an MVC project where all your assets are going to be loaded here, but it also has all of your server-side stuff going on. Your pages are done here, kind of more like a Razor Pages application, which we'll see later. Now, the Blazor WebAssembly client-side app has two projects. It has the client-side version, which is going to have your pages in it, just like you would expect to see, the same data, the same code in those pages. So you can see the code is not going to be much different. The difference is we're injecting an HTTP client here because this is going to be on the client side, and the code here is still, the weather forecast is still there. And so it calls to the get from JSON async now for the HTTP client for the weather forecast service. and that's going to be loaded in. So it'll be a little different in the interaction there, but the main thing is down here we have our weather app, which is shared between the two, and that's the weather forecast. It has that object so that that object can be used both on the server side and on the client side. And your pages down here are just going to be your shared page for your layout, your error, and then you have a controller, which is going to handle your weather forecast get calls. So we'll put a little breakpoint there, and then we'll run this one. So the operation of these two applications is going to be identical. What you'll notice is that the server-side application spins up much more quickly. Now, why do you think that might be? Generally, it's because, I would guess, that it's because this is actually pre-compiling all the web client stuff into WebAssembly for you. And I'll show you the difference here in a second. So there's a client. So again, we're clicking. We're doing the same things we were doing before. We go to fetch data. It still calls back over here to the controller, which is what we would expect. It gives us that data just like we would want. So we have both applications doing exactly the same thing. So what's the difference? Why does it matter? Well, one thing that matters is how you want your application to work. Do you want more stuff to happen on the server or more stuff to happen on the client? The other thing is going to be, the same thing. The differences between the client side and this and what the code it renders is. So here, let's go ahead and go to the fetch data here again, and I'll just clear through this. I must have hit a button, shoot. I apologize. I must have done something that caused it to not build. Oh, probably because I have both apps running, shoot. Okay, well, what I wanted to show you, let me run this one really quick, is if you look at the view page source, on the client side app, all you have is your app loading page, you have your Blazor component here, and then that's, right here is your script source where you're going to see all of your WebAssembly. So that's the WebAssembly that was needed in order to run all of that application. This is on the client side. So let me stop this one. I think there must be a conflict running them similarly in the same directory, or I did something that broke it. So hopefully, I'm not sure what happened. All right, so that's unfortunate. I could spin up a new server project and show you. What I'll ask you to do today, rather than waste any more time, is to just trust me that if you spun up the server side client and did the, if you looked at the source on that, you would see more HTML, you would see much more code, like what you would expect to see from an MVC view. That's the main difference. So, all right, I'm gonna just check quickly to see if any questions have come in. I'm not seeing anything, so that's great. Again, I'm asking you to hold them to the end, so that makes sense. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about with you is the gRPC. And so basically gRPC is going to be the new protocol for communicating between client and services. And so in the past, we've used WCF. And I know if you've used WCF, right now, one of two things is happening to you. You're either saying, hallelujah, I don't want to work with WCF ever again, or you're saying, man, I have really mastered all the little nuances of WCF. Why would you change this on me? Because I love it. So you're probably in one of those two camps. There's not much of an in-between from what I've seen. Either you love it or you hate it, and you'll either love this change or wonder why they did it. And ultimately, it's going to come down to serialization of the data and just the way that the client server can communicate with this Google Proto much more easily. There's a lot less configuration, a little more setup on the project side, but once everything is wired up, there's a lot less of, you don't have to worry about your addresses, your binding, your contract. It's all predefined in the Proto. You're good to go. So just like WCF, there's a contract that's going to define your objects. So you still be able to have well-defined types that are going to give you a chance to work with the different communication protocols across the way. So it communicates across HTTP2. And so that's the only way it communicates though. There's no TCP, there's no underlying connections. That's why you don't need your bindings. Your contracts are going to just be there, and your addresses are obviously going to be just your connection to the service. So it uses binary serialization formatting and a bidirectional streaming and flow. So this is cool. You can communicate back and forth, kind of like a chat client, and go back and forth across the stream, which is awesome. When you build in your gRPC, you're going to need different references for tools, ASP.NET Core, and a client for the gRPC libraries in order to make things work. And you'll use these proto files in the item group and project config. You'll add a service reference if it's already existing, just like you would if you think back to the XML services. There's a way to do that same kind of thing. The startup class then is going to add, so what you can do is actually build out a gRPC service that lives on it independently, and that gRPC service is going to have the ability to add the gRPC in the configure, and in the configuration you just map the endpoint to your type of service. So we're going to do the basic greeter demo project here in a second. So you would create out your project in the template here, and then you would add in services on an existing project this way. This is when you right click and say add the services. So what I'd like to do next is go ahead and just walk you through a quick demo on how to get the how to make a gRPC service, and then we'll actually add it into a web app eventually. So let me start a new instance of Visual Studio. And in this time, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new project, and this is going to be a gRPC service. So again, that's going to be under services in your limitation here. And let's go ahead and move this back to live demos. And we'll just do gRPC demo here. And we'll just call this greeter service because that's what it's going to build out of the box. So we'll make the gRPC service. If you want it to be in Docker, you need to check this. You'd have to have Docker desktop if you want to run it locally, obviously. All right, and that's going to spin up a new project. And what you'll notice is that it looks a lot like any other project. It's got to start up in a program. So what are those doing? So the program is using the iHost builder to inject the host, which is important. We'll talk about the iHost builder in just a little bit. And then it has a startup injection there, which is going to then say, give me the add gRPC services. And down here, you'll see your endpoints for the greeter service mapped in. And so once you have that, it knows to say, hey, if I call the greeter service, this is what I'm looking for. This is the greeter service. It's very straightforward. It has a say hello method that just responds with hello to whatever name you send it. And ultimately, the most important piece of this is the proto. And the proto is generated, and it has the greeter service itself with a RPC call to say hello, taking in a hello request, returning a hello reply. And those are defined here as messages, and that's pretty straightforward. So if you were to run this, then locally the client would start up, and it would run on the port that you define. And so other thing to mention is the Kestrel endpoint as well. Here is going to use the protocol HTTP, which is in the app settings. So if we go ahead and run this and just get it up and running, it's going to start up my greeter service, and it's going to default to localhost 5001 locally. So that's where it's actually running right now. All right, so we have a greeter service. How do we actually work with it? Let's go and create quickly a MVC web app. So here I'm going to just create a new project, and I'm going to choose, this time I'm going to choose just my ASP.NET Core web application. And in the live demos, gRPC demo, let's change this to what's new 31. And we're going to call this what's new Core 31. So this is just going to be a basic web application. And here we're going to, MVC web application with HTTPS. You can add in authentication if you want, so that it has services for either the cloud or for a local database here. So we're going to do that. And that way I could have identity if I wanted it. If I could run update database commands. All right, and so now on my web application itself, what I want to do is make sure that I can actually call the service. So I need to bring in the gRPC libraries. So I can do that in Package Manager console, install package grpc.net.client. That's going to bring in a bunch of stuff. And then I'm going to install another package, gRPC .tools. And then I'm finally going to bring in one more package, which is going to be google.protobuf. And that allows me to have that prototype understanding. So the next thing I need to do is add a protocol folder. So I'm just going to add a new folder here for protos. And then I'm going to get my shared proto that was generated from the service. So if I go back to my live demos, under my gRPC demo, greeter service protos, I have this greet.proto. I'm just going to copy that and I'm going to drop that into my web app proto folder. So there's my greet proto. And then what I need to do is actually add some code. So I've got a snippet pre-prepared here. Hopefully I can copy and paste, which I can't. All right, so this is coming straight from the tutorial. So let me just go to that link. If it'll let me do this. I apologize. I did not realize I could not click on the link in my preparation slide. All right, so I'm literally just following this documentation here. And what I want to have is, so there we installed our 3 packages. I need to add to the item group, which I would have forgotten to do. So we're going to grab this, and that's going to go into our project config. So you see it already added the protos folder, but I need to add the actual prototype definition here so it knows it's there. And then I want to just grab this code to call. Okay. All right. I'm sorry. I'm having a little bit of a struggle getting the code that I wanted. So let's go ahead and set up what it had. So you can see that this is using a console app, and the difference is, of course, we're not using a console app. So, but the same var channel information that we're going to want to use is going to be our same code. We're just going to use it in a controller. So we want to keep our greeter service going. We want our web app up. Okay. So let me just add a method to the home controller. And that method is going to be called call service. And that is going to grab the gRPC channel from address. It's going to get a greeter client. It's going to say hello, sending a message that I'm what's new, and then it's going to it needs a view model called call service view model, which I need to add here. And so let's go ahead and add that under models quickly. Add a folder here, view models. And under there, let's add a new view model. Now we could just use the hello world or whatever the greeter proto defined as objects as our view model as well if you wanted. But you're probably likely going to want to add more than just the greeter stuff. So it's probably good to see having, you know, a simple view model as well. And this is going to be called the call service view model. So you have that. It's going to have a property or string or message. It's a very simple view model. And then back in our home controller, that should allow us to bring that in. And then we should be able to bring these in from the proto, from the client. So the next thing we need to do is have a call service view under the home folder views. So we're just going to add a new view. We'll just do a razor view. And we'll call it call service. And we can bring in the call service view model, but we're not going to do any scaffolding right now. So let's just go ahead and make it blank. Should have taken the empty version. Anyway, let's go ahead and add the model here, which is going to be the call service view model. And then here under the call service, let's just do a quick, HR to separate our page out a little bit. And then we'll just do a span, and we'll just do the at model.message property. All right, and so when that runs, then what we'll see is our home controller will trigger. It will call to our gRPC client, and it will then inject the message from the client into the page. So I didn't have to set up any addresses, binding, and contracts other than I needed the HTTP link where the host was served, localhost 5001. So you would need to probably configure that better. But then you would do your call service. It'd be under home, home/call service. And that makes a call out and gets back the view model with the message, hello, what's new, and shows it up. So that's how easy it is to wire up a gRPC service. You create the service, you can use it, run it through your code just like you would any other call. And there's a lot less configuration you would see in the typical WCF land. All right, so one last thing I want to show you on gRPC before we go is that I want to say, here you can say add a service reference. So if you had existing service dependencies, you can make sure they're here. For example, our greeter client, or like the old XML web services in the days of old, if you remember that, you would go here and select your gRPC and then find either the file or the URL where it's being served, and go ahead and put that up, you know, what you want to have generated and build that out, and you would have your connection wired up within your .NET web app. So that's gRPC in a nutshell. So the next thing to cover is that JSON is changing, and that might seem scary because why is JSON changing? Well, the format is not changing. The only thing that's changing is they're going to move from Newtonsoft to system.text.json. So you'll see this coming in a lot of the new libraries. And if you want to go back to Newtonsoft, you can always bring Newtonsoft back in. The overall goal of this is to have faster API integrations with JSON so that hopefully the performance will be much more improved over even the performance of Newtonsoft, which is awesome because Newtonsoft was great. You can also do async JSON read and write actions, and it's going to be UTF-8 formatted, which is, you know, obviously makes sense. So SignalR is also changing a little bit, and what's changing in SignalR is not as much as you would think, but it will be pretty significant in that it's going to swap out the JSON libraries to the new system.txt to try to improve the performance there. So once again, if you wanted to use Newtonsoft, you can always bring it back in. There are instructions, directions on how to do that, but it will default to the new system.text.json libraries for the .NET Core world. One of the cooler features is called automatic reconnect. So you can set up rolling time attempts on this, just like you would with any other service retry or anything like that, where you can say, I want this to run at intervals of 1 second over and over again, or you can say 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds, whatever you want to do to configure how many times it will retry and what the intervals between retry are. Every time it reconnects, it does get a new connection ID. If you want automatic reconnect on your SignalR, you will have to opt into it. It's not wired up out of the box, so you just basically opt in. And basically, once you do that, you get events for on connecting and on reconnected that you can leverage in your code. Probably the biggest change that probably, if you're using SignalR, will solve one of your bigger pains is that there are now there's going to be one place to register your code for SignalR connections. Whereas before, you might have had to sign in or make the connection on each controller or on each view or whatever you did to make your SignalR work on the page you were on. Now you're going to be able to do that right in the default section of your startup where you build out your code. You can say, I want to basically add these routes right here in the app use routing. And so map razor pages, routes map hub, chat hub, etc. That's just code that was on their sample demos. But what it does, it gives you a chance to see you can map in the route for your SignalR in one place, and then every place in your code can leverage it. So that's probably one of the bigger changes. Again, here you see connection builders with the automatic reconnect. That's the opt-in. The different intervals there. The defaults are, I think, 0, 2, 5, 10, 30, something like that. And so you can override it to do your own. Whatever intervals you want there. So there's like 2 seconds, 5 seconds, it is in milliseconds. And the code, of course, to on reconnect and on reconnected, on reconnecting and on reconnected, you can actually wire that up on that connection there to fire different things to happen. So if I have a new connection ID, I need to change something out. When I'm reconnected, I can get that new connection ID and send it on, or whatever I need to do once I'm certain I'm back up to a running state. A couple of other big changes that you likely won't have to interact with much, but should be aware of, are going to be your hosting and startup setups. Now, the biggest change here is going to be that you're going to use the generic host instead of a web host builder. And this is awesome because it gives us a chance to inject things more than just web. So whereas before everything was going to be done through the web only in the host builders, now you can actually do a generic host, which allows you to do things like services. And gRPC services and other things like that. So your environment variables are going to be changed within the hosting from ASP.NET Core to .NET. So not a big deal. It makes a lot of sense though, because not every host is going to be an ASP.NET host anymore. So if you're keying on that for some reason, you would want to be aware of that. There's a new thing to create the default builder that you're going to leverage. This is where you're going to build out your hosting information, such as the base path for where you're hosting from, any settings files, environment variables, arguments that you're taking in, depending on how and what you're doing. And then you have your app configuration that you can also leverage in the iHost builder. And so the startup constructor is limited. My slide got slid down here a little bit, but it's limited to 3 injection types now instead of a bunch of them that were before. But the actual injection is much more robust, so it's pretty cool. All right, so the next thing I wanted to cover was there's some new event counters. So you can think of event counters like performance counters for every platform. And so these allow you to basically count things on the computer that are happening, not just on Windows anymore. Now event counters go across platform, just like everything else with .NET Core. So that's really great. You can have new account metrics for requests per second, total requests, current requests, and failed requests. So just a bunch of request information. The nice thing to note is that it does work well with application insights. And so this is just a list on the left-hand side of the ones that were already there. You see the new 4 are in a new namespace called Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Hosting, and there's more information on how you can connect to those or get information about the event counters. So another thing I wanted to show you today is health checks, because health checks are really awesome. So if you've ever worked for a service provider and you have multiple applications going, or even if you work in an organization that has multiple applications, there's nothing more important to you than knowing when an application dies, right? Or when something's not working the way it should, a service isn't responding, such as the database is down or something like that, because every minute can count depending on how transactional you are, or things like that. So health metrics allow you to set up specific code that you can write yourself to be able to go ahead and write code to handle the different health checks. So you can do things like disk resources and CPU, or you can do things like, is my call to the third-party API working like it should? Or is my service up and responding? Or is my database available? And you can write the code yourself to handle exactly how you need to check that. So what I wanted to do is do a quick demo of writing out a health check so that you can see how this works. And we can use our same application we were using before. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and stop the greeter service. Well, we'll just leave it running, I guess. Let me get the .NET Core app up here. So this is the one that we had built out just a few minutes ago. What I want to do is build a health check into this, and we're just going to start from the ground up on this. And so the first thing I want to do is add the health checks and the endpoints in the startup config. And so let me grab that quick. So in the configure services method of startup, the first thing we're going to do, and this is not going to be the final version. I just want to show you this kind of from the ground up here, so you see what starts to happen. Here we're going to have our services add health checks, and I need a services variable. Sorry, configure services. I'm in the wrong place, or I set the application up wrong. There we go. Configure services. All right, sorry. So now we're going to add our health checks like we expected. So there's how we're going to add in health checks to use them. And then what I want to do in the configuration method is actually map out the route for our health check. And so that I'm just going to go down here to the very part after mapping the Razor pages. I'm going to map the health checks. And so right now, I don't have any health checks written. I don't have anything handling any health checks. So by default, my site, I would hope, would say that it's healthy, which makes sense, right? There's nothing being checked, so there's nothing to fail. So how do we make it fail? Well, what we need to do is create our custom code that we want to make things fail with. And so underneath our model, I'm just going to quickly create a new model here called the health check. We'll just call it example health check. And in that code, what I want to do is bring in a little bit of code here for you, and then we'll walk through it. So this health check result is going to be the result of the health check. So we need to get our health checks diagnostics included. We have, of course, a cancellation token for threading. And then we have, what I've done here is created a random variable that's just going to fail every other time, 50% of the time or whatever. So it's just checking mod 2. And if it's healthy, it'll return that it's healthy. If it's not, it'll return unhealthy. So you would think, great, now I have a health check, but we need to wire it up. So the next step then is to go back to your startup, where we use the health checks up here. We're going to just chain in the new code. And so that is just going to be adding the example health check class type to the end of this. And so we'll need to bring that in. And so you see we add our health checks, so you can add your other checks here. Not sure what didn't like there. Let me grab the whole statement. Doesn't like my parameter type. That's strange. Oh, maybe I just need to build. Hold on. It won't let me build because there's an error. You might not recognize that I have that model, that example health checks built out yet. Hold on. And voila, now it's actually built. No? Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to use my pre-built version, and my pre-built version has the exact same code, so I'm not sure what I did wrong there, but you see here that I have my add check for the example health check. I have my example health check code here, same as it did before, and then my services, I chained it together the same way, and I have my route for health there. So, and of course now I'm getting clicky, but let's go ahead and run it here. This is my, of course, this is my practice run, but I'm not sure why my live run didn't work. I probably did something wonky. If I say health now, you can see it's healthy, and then let's just unhealthy. So you can see that it's going to fail a few times whenever that mod we're expected to. All right, so that's a health check, but that's pretty awesome because it gives you the chance to inject your different variables into there, different classes into there, whatever you need to do to check services or check third-party APIs or whatever you want to write to need to do that. So hopefully you find that as useful as I think it is. All right, moving on. The next thing I want to cover is Razor directives. Now, we already saw implements already. So implements just allows you to inject code into the Razor page itself. And then the attribute is allowing you to do things like using the authorize attribute. So now you can add that directly in your Razor page rather than on your controller. I mean, this all makes sense when you start to really understand the ecosystem and how things are wired up and how the different entry points work across different types. So it makes sense that they would want to give you an opportunity to not have a controller and inject authorization. Another cool feature that we're not going to do a demo today because we just don't have time, but I want to cover real quick is called the worker service. So now we have background jobs available to us. They're similar to cron jobs. You can time and schedule them. You can run long-running tasks. You can do background processing. You can run them as a Windows service. So you can create a worker service and then run it as a Windows service. It doesn't have to be .NET. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be ASP.NET. Windows services can also host ASP.NET Core now through the same host injection that we've seen. So you can run a service through the ASP.NET Core website, or you can run a ASP.NET Core website hosted by a Windows service. So you don't have to use IIS anymore if you don't want to. So here when you're creating the worker service, and that worker service is just a project template. And when that generates up, what you'll see is it's pretty vanilla on the configuration as of right now. They may add to that in the future, but you get a worker where your main code is going to happen in the execute async method. And that is essentially going to show where you're writing your code. So here, this is just the default that's spun up is just basically logging until someone says don't log anymore. It's background service is its default type. And then when you run your startup program, again, what you see is you have your configure services just like you would with the web, but this time it's not a web builder. It's a host for the services. So it's an add hosted service for the worker. So we're no longer limited to just web hosting injections here in the create host builder, which is the whole point of going to the generic host. So here you see what's really cool is you can chain them. So you build out your web just like you would configure your web host defaults with your web builder using your startup program. And then you can say, hey, also give me this service for the videos watcher that's from their demo here at the Visual Studio Demos. So if you want to look through that on your own, that's something I would certainly recommend looking into because likely you have situations where you want to use background jobs or long-running processes that you don't want to bog down your website with. So another major change that you may or may not be aware of at this point is a new framework for developing web applications called Razor Pages. Now, Razor Pages, I like to think of these essentially as the new web forms. Now, I know that it's not the same, and it's souped up, it's different, it's a little bit better in some of the ways that things are working, but it's a lot like web forms in that you're going to have your view and your code behind files in the same place. So no more controllers folder, views folder. And that's going to make it so that you can actually see your code right with the page that it's going to go with. So if you're a web forms user and you're moving into the .NET Core ecosystem or the .NET 5 ecosystem, where web forms isn't going to be as popular anymore, if even supported in the future, that's a whole other debate. But for now, you could think of new projects. Perhaps you would want to try Razor Pages. That's actually what Microsoft recommends if you're a web forms developer, just as your path, because it's a little bit more straightforward than MVC. The MVC learning curve can be a little daunting with all the configuration behind the scenes of if you put a controller here, you need a view here. If you're from web forms, that doesn't make a lot of sense when you first get started. So Razor Pages is a gap bridge for that for you. So the nice thing about using a Razor Page is it also gives you that single responsibility principle validation, meaning that if you've worked with MVC for a long time, like I have, you've obviously seen your controllers grow. Every controller that you've ever written probably has something for the index page and maybe a create, edit, delete method, but then it might have 15,000 other things in it, right? If you don't separate your service layer and all other things, controller bloat is a real thing. And so what Razor Pages might do for you, and I'm not saying you couldn't get controller bloat in a Razor Page, but what it might do for you is keep you focused on the single responsibility. This is a one-time deal. This controller, its only job is to respond to requests and send responses back to the web. And then everything else I should delegate somewhere else. So even like other routes have to be done with handlers. Just like if you were way back in the .NET 1, 2 ecosystem, you might remember the ASHX files for the handler. Or if you've come from the Java world, it's similar to a servlet in that it's going to handle a request and then do the routing and stuff that it needs to do for you to work. All right, so I wanted to spin up a Razor Pages demo because it's actually quite straightforward, quite easy to work with, and it'll give us a chance to see how fast you can get going. So just like an MVC project, you can scaffold everything you need. So let's go ahead and just do that quickly. I don't want you to think that this is any faster than an MVC project. It's the same thing. It's just going to be wired differently. So you could spin up and scaffold an MVC project just as quickly. But let's go ahead and do an ASP.NET Web Core application. This is going to be a Razor Pages app. If I can find it. All right, let's just go all over the world here. Sorry. I thought it was under web. Maybe it's not, or I'm just doing something wrong in a live demo. So I want to do a Razor Pages app. Oh yeah, of course. It's an ASP.NET Core web application. All right, so it's an ASP.NET Core web application. It's just not an MVC version of it. So let's do this as the Razor Pages. And let me just copy this here so we don't get too much stuff in the same folder, even though we're already have achieved that. All right, so this time we're just going to do an empty web application. We're not going to try to do, we could do the web application here as well, I guess, with the Razor Pages content. So let's go ahead and do that. We're just not doing the MVC version of the web application. Actually, let's, just to be safe, I know it works for sure from an empty, so I'm going to do that. All right. And then I'm going to add item folder. Oh, I'm sorry, that should be models, sorry. I'm going to add a new class here for item. And for item, it's going to be a very simple, straightforward int ID and string name. So nothing fancy there. And you know what? I forgot to wire up my database. I am so sorry. So let me try this again. And I actually, sorry, I was trying to look at my notes and I clicked the wrong button. All right, let me try this again. Wipe that first part from your mind. Pretend that didn't happen. All right, so we're going to create a new web project this time. And this time I actually am going to take the web template without the MVC because I want the pages to be wired up for me so I don't have to build that. All right, so you know what? It doesn't matter where it is right now. So let's just leave it there. And I'm going to go ahead and create this. And then I'm going to do the web application this time because I want the Razor Pages content. I just don't want to have to build that myself. Ah, I did it again. Keep getting ahead of myself. One last try. Forgive me. Okay. So we're going to create a new project. It's going to be a web application. I'm slowing down a little bit here so that I get this right. And I'm going to choose the this location. Yeah, I want the web application. We'll just call it Razor Pages 2, I guess. Where is my choice? Here we go. Okay. I need my authentication. The reason I did this is because I don't want to have to do anything with .NET in any framework. So go ahead and get my individual accounts built up. So that gives me wired up database out of the box that I can leverage. All right, so here we go. So we have our areas, our data, and our pages. So right now I do have some pages already in place, and then I have areas and data for my migrations and such. So let's add in that folder again. And this is going to be for models, whatever you want to call it. You could bring this in as a library too. You wouldn't have to have it in your app. And let's do a class. This is just going to be called item. And here we're going to do a prop for int ID. I want to type that every time. And then another prop for string name. Okay, so we have those two things in place. And now what I want to do after I have that is I want to go ahead and scaffold it. So under pages, I want to go ahead and add a new folder for items. And then under that, I'm going to right click and say add new scaffolded item. And we're going to do Razor page using Entity Framework CRUD. And then we're going to choose our item model. And our data context is going to need to be made new because I haven't done anything. So let's go ahead and just click new. And we can name this whatever you want. I'm going to leave it as is. I'm going to leave everything else as is. This is going to scaffold out the items pages. And the cool thing about this is it'll give us a chance to just quickly look at the pages on how they're wired up with their controller, in quotes, right with the view. So you see here, I have my create view, just like you would see in an MVC project, CS/HTML file. It looks just like a view in its layout and it has everything that you would expect from an MVC view, but the code for it, for the controller, is right here. And you see the difference is I only have an onGet and an onPost handler. And so if I want other handlers than get and post, I need to write that specific handler to do that. But the whole point is to try to keep you from doing that, to keep these controllers from bloating. And this main job is to say, what do you do on a get and what do you do on a post? And ultimately then everything's in place. I just need to quickly scaffold everything out. So in my database, so let's go ahead and do that quickly. So I'm going to do add migration, initial stuff. Don't fire me. That's a terrible name. But that stays in the database forever. Great. So my Entity Framework core version is older than that of the runtime, so I need to update. So that was also unexpected. So once again, this is just a happy, fancy thing that happens where you get to do some stuff. So go and find your updates and make sure that you update your packages. It looks like everything got released and is updated here to 3.1.6. So let's go ahead and do that. And hopefully that will solve my package manager console problem. And I can actually do this. This is the joy of life. More than one DB context found, specify which one. Okay, so there was a context already, I just missed it, probably from my identity. Okay, so now I need to do the funny thing that happens when you have multiple contexts, which try to avoid doing this ever, is context type name equals context type name, and then I think it's just Razor pages to context. And I may have a problem here because I didn't plan on this happening. And so Razor pages to context. It may need to be this, Razor pages to context, Razor pages to data. Is it context type name is not what it, okay. So that might be the EF6 version. There we go. Okay, so yeah, EF6 to EF core, a few things changed in the migration. One of them is that. So there it was. It was able to do that. Now I can say update database. And I'm gonna have to do the context again, unfortunately. And Razor pages to .data.razor pages to context. So hopefully ordinarily you would have just one context and you wouldn't have this issue going on, but because I created that initial migration from my identities, I wired up an extra context this time. All right, so I'm not going to log in. Nothing's asking me to authorize, so hopefully I won't have to come back and reinitialize with my identity stuff. Hopefully I should be able to just go here and say items. Oops, sorry. And it's not liking that either. Let's just go to items index then. I might. Okay. Yeah. So again, I'm having another issue, yet another issue that I wasn't expecting to happen. What should have happened here, that it's not important to this demo, is that had I wired everything up correctly from the start, the Razor pages would have loaded and we would have now had the ability to easily interact with our items, pages for index, and create, update, delete. It would have been listed out in a table just like you would expect on any scaffolded project. So I must have done something wrong because I brought in the other identities and or something else I did along the way. Didn't quite get configured quite correctly. But the whole point of this was more than that. You could solve those problems. The more point of this is to get this part solved where you see how it works with the on get and the on post being the main part of the controller, and the controller working right with the page, and the page looking very similar to what you would expect to see in any MVC application. All right, so mercifully, I think that's the last demo. And a couple things I want to talk about to close out are just going to be some changes that are coming. So just note that there are some major changes coming with same-site cookies, and that's going to affect you if you have iframes or if you're trying to do cross origin requests. So make sure that you read up on what same-site cookies are doing. Again, we've already talked about Newtonsoft JSON's not going to be caked in. You can still bring it in, and the same thing's going to happen with a lot of the other libraries, which is going to be different for some of you. When you're building out new projects, you're not going to get a lot of the stuff built in. You have to actually bring them in through NuGet. So for one thing, EF core, which is why I wanted to do the identity thing to bring all that stuff in, so I wouldn't have to go through the whole NuGet package, which we had to go to anyway because of the updates. But anyway, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the framework more lightweight. They're still leaving MVC in. There may be some debate on why or not between the community and the actual designers, but the designers, and what I personally believe are rightfully so, are leaving MVC in because the MVC framework is giving Microsoft the ability to have their default standard. This is what we want you to use. This is where we're at. And maybe as Blazor matures or as Razor pages take off, if they do, maybe that will change where you'll have to actually bring in MVC as well. But for now, the MVC libraries are going to be baked in, and you'll have those. But you won't have your EF cores. You'll have to bring those in. The Roslyn code analyzer is also changing a little bit, but they're still releasing new updates. So it's still alive and well if you like to write compiler stuff around Roslyn or whatever you need it for. There's still ability to use it. You just have to bring it in. It's not in by default anymore. And so basically, to kind of close out, let's just talk about the future. So we saw a lot of things that came with .NET Core that have matured to the point now where .NET Core's ecosystem is actually quite robust. Blazor obviously being the hot keyword buzz term that everybody wants to know about, if not use. And I can see why that would be widely adopted in the future. But what's going to happen soon, this is actually happening in November, so we're talking about 4 months from now. There's going to be an ecosystem change in that .NET 5 is going to be released. There's actually in preview 7 right now, and you can go play with it, but you do have to have a preview version of Visual Studio 2019, or you have to enable using preview libraries inside of your settings for Visual Studio 2019 in order to work with the preview. I would recommend doing that if you have some time. Play around, see what's new, etc. .NET 5 is going to be awesome. It's going to be the new version of .NET, and it's going to include anything that you would call .NET Framework and anything that you would call .NET Core. Now here's the thing, .NET Framework last version release was 4.8. There's not going to be any more .NET Framework, okay? It's gone. It will, don't be freaked out by that. It's just meaning that they're not going to call .NET Framework anymore. They're just going to call it .NET 5. And everything that you're used to using should still work in .NET 5. It just won't be called Framework anymore. Same thing with Core. Hey, I'm building an ASP.NET Core application will no longer be a thing. Hey, I'm building a .NET 5 ASP.NET application. So everything's going to merge back together. So when they separated, just a quick brief history lesson here. 2016, new CEO decided Microsoft needed to be open source. Great decision, has been awesome for every developer, and .NET Core was born from that to satisfy the need to keep everybody still running on the Windows framework with .NET Framework, but also to start exporting and using .NET on Mono on Linux and Macs and such. And so that's what brought .NET Core into play. Now .NET Core is matured now, .NET Framework is obviously matured, but now we're at a point where everything can come back together. .NET Core can host what it needs to host in order for .NET Framework stuff to work, and .NET Core can work on any machine. So .NET Core is now also merging back in, and .NET 5 is essentially the one solution to rule them all. And it will have all the stuff you need to run your .NET Framework stuff, as well as all of your stuff that runs on Linux or you know, Apple or whatever that star-nix thing you want to run it on. .NET 5 will have performance improvements. It has a new assembly generator, if you care about that stuff, to run on both Intel and ARM chips, and it's basically going to go all in on Blazor with a lot of Blazor improvements. So that's going to be cool. Along with .NET 5, EF Core 5 is also being released. Now, EF Core 5 is interesting because it's going to keep the core name, which is strange because everything else is losing the core name. But the core part of that has to stay because there was already an EF 5. So we couldn't have, you know, EF 5 or EF 5 again or something. So EF Core 5 is going to be the new version or the vNext of EF Core. It's actually already out as well in preview. You can actually use it in .NET Core 3.1 projects, which is interesting. So it's going to be ready to go as well. So in November, expect everything to go to the 5 moniker, .NET 5, as well as EF Core 5 being the newest version of EF Core. All right, so in summary, today we talked about Blazor. We saw some demos on that. We talked about gRPC, using that instead of WCF to do your service calls, your remote procedure calls across client to services. We looked at some different performance and monitoring improvements that happened in the ecosystem as well. We talked about how the packaging means you're going to have more NuGet interaction, less things baked in. JSON SignalR changes with that JSON from JSON Newtonsoft to JSON or system.text.json. We looked a little bit at worker processes. We fumbled through a little bit of Razor pages. Sorry that the final demo didn't work there, but hopefully you got the overview enough that you know at this point, hey, Blazor might be an option for me, or you know, I'm going to stick with MVC, or you know, this client really wants me to use Razor pages, or wants me to use web forms, but I don't want to use web forms, so I'm going to convince them to use Razor pages. Whatever you need to do, you have hopefully seen enough in this demo in this talk to go forth and make .NET great. So hopefully everybody enjoyed the talk. Any questions from anybody who's here today? All right, I'm not seeing any questions coming in, so hopefully that doesn't mean I gave you a little bit of overwhelming fatigue here, but hopefully, again, you can watch this back on Skill Me Up later and get any more questions you have answered. Reach out to me. You can hit me up at BL Gorman on Twitter or Brian L. Gorman on LinkedIn, and or bgorman@opsagility.com. So once again, thanks for listening to this expert talk on ASP.NET Core 3.1, what is new. And my name is Brian Gorman. This has been a presentation of Skill Me Up training.